So I do want to thank Jeanette for inviting me to talk. I think we're sort of going to see something a bit different than the last two talks here. This is more of a case study. And I know the title is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but honestly, if you worked or lived at Travis Air Force Base before this year, you might have given the California tiger salamander the status of mythical beast, because even though there were rumors that it existed on the base, that somebody had seen one at some point in the past, most people didn't believe that it existed. But 2017 changed all of that. So, and it makes sense, because if you go looking for tiger salamanders, you really aren't going to find them. They're terrestrial salamanders. They live under the ground for the majority of their lives. They're using ground squirrel burrows, gopher burrows, large soil cracks, anything to protect them from really hot and dry conditions during the summertime in California. Once the rain starts to fall, and hopefully very soon, the pools that they use as breeding ponds start to fill with water. They're using large vernal pools, they use playa pools, sag ponds, but more often than not, they're using stock ponds that are used for cattle watering on these large ranches. The adults migrate into these pools sometime December, January, February. They mate. The females lay their eggs on emergent vegetation or other structures that are in the ponds, and then the adults take off after a couple of weeks to go back to their business in the uplands. Well, the eggs turn into larvae. The larvae spend months trying to get big and strong enough to crawl out of the pool. They metamorph. The metamorphs then walk into the grassland at probably the most inhospitable time to be a salamander, sometime late May, early June, searching for a crack, a hole, something to protect them from what's going to be a very hot and dry summer. I should mention that the population we're talking about is actually the Central Valley distinct population segment of the California tiger salamander, which is listed by both the feds and the state as threatened. So on the 31st of May, 2017, 6 California tiger salamanders were seen crossing runway 21 left on Travis Air Force Base. And the airfield management personnel that spotted these salamanders in the middle of the night were really looking for rocks or big chunks of concrete that could get sucked into the intake of an aircraft, and instead they found these little salamanders. Well, they had been told, again, this mythical beast, the salamander, could be present, and actually they created these signs to say, be aware and do not touch the California tiger salamander. But these guys didn't look the same. They didn't have spots, they weren't very big, and so they weren't sure that that's what they were seeing. And of course, it was dark out. So they contacted the natural resources team. The biologists came out the next morning. They confirmed, yes, these are juvenile California tiger salamanders, but nobody really knew where they were coming from. Everybody thought this is just a fluke. This is some sort of a freak situation. There's a ton of conservation land surrounding Travis Air Force Base. So the thinking was that these were some stray salamanders, had gotten lost, coming from some of these large breeding ponds that were known to the southeast of the base. But it became clear very quickly in the next couple of days that this wasn't a fluke, that this was some sort of a phenomenon that was happening. And on the 6th of June, I became involved, and we had found a couple of salamanders that were desiccated on the runway, so they hadn't quite made it across before the sun baked them. So we realized we need to sort of get ahead of this and start doing early morning runway checks to clear the live salamanders off of the runway and move them to safe locations where they could hopefully survive and continue their life. And this was working. So we were getting about a half a dozen juvenile salamanders that we were collecting on the runway and moving them to their safe burrow sites. And then the weather changed. And on the 12th of June, 83 salamanders were swarming around, well, swarming, that's a little extreme, but they were wandering around the runway. And we had to shut the runway down for several hours, and it was a big job to try to find enough burrow space for these salamanders. And it was at this point that things got real, and we realized we needed a better approach than just going out and shutting the runway down for a few hours every morning. We also realized that our thought that the salamanders were coming mainly from the conservation lands to the southeast of the base was probably not correct. This is runway 21 left. All the little red dots, we tried as hard as we could to GPS in the locations of the salamanders as we were collecting them, but we finally narrowed down the primary source of the salamanders, or actually the only source of these salamanders, coming from a stock pond on the neighbor's property here, but very close to the fence line of Travis Air Force Base. The perimeter of the base, by the way, is this black line here, you can see. And this stock pond was actually created by the military decades ago. It was used as a borrow site for fill that probably went to build up the roads or the runway on the base. But it was definitely full, and it was a perfect habitat for breeding salamanders. We also noticed that all of the salamanders were headed in the same direction, and so this arrow indicates they were definitely emerging over here, and they wanted to go here. So, you know, sort of why did the salamander cross the runway? Well, definitely to get to the other side. They were seeking out this area over here, but of course they had to cross. There's a road that circles, I don't know if you can really see it here, perimeter road. They had to cross 2 roads, and in some cases 2 runways to get to the other side. And so when I got it, at this point with 83 salamanders, we realized that we needed to take even more drastic action, and so we decided to set up a drift fence, which is along the, I'm not doing that anymore. Okay, so the red line indicates where we decided to put a drift fence to try to trap the salamanders and then FedEx them to the other side to the location where all the aqua dots are. That's where we decided was the safest place to put the salamanders, and just hoped that they would continue their migration east onto the lovely conservation lands. So we put in 1,500 feet of drift fence. This was just silt fencing that we bought at the Home Depot. We buried it 6 inches into the ground. And of course we did this, you know, the soil was like concrete. We were doing this at the, you know, we had record heat, 100-degree temperatures for 3 days as we were putting this fence in. Lots of military help though, that was great. And we installed 23 pitfall traps along this fence line with 2 at, 1 at each end. And we ran the traps for 27 nights. Our pitfall traps were just 2-gallon buckets, painter's buckets, with the lid inverted, little wooden pegs to keep it open, and we had some nice moist sphagnum moss and a sponge in there to keep the salamanders happy when they fell in. Our trapping was very successful. We had 666 CTS, you know, the number of the beast. I don't know how that happened, but it was coincidental, of course. And of course, very coincidentally, that very first trap night, the weather broke, and we had really high relative humidity, low temperatures, I think a little bit of rainfall, and we ended up with 200 salamanders in the traps that first night, which made me cry, actually, because it was a lot to deal with in one day. But luckily, tapered off, as you can see from this chart, and our real measure of merit was, this isn't working. Okay, the real measure of merit was, you know, if we were able to keep the salamanders from getting onto the runway. And by 6 days in, we ended up with no salamanders on the runway or on any of the roads. And so that was great. And we continued to do our runway checks for another 5 or 6 days just to be sure that our trapping was effective. And we were definitely effective. So we discontinued the runway checks. The other thing it was telling us was that our hope that the salamanders would continue east and that they wouldn't turn around, the ones that we were relocating, that they wouldn't turn around and come back towards the runway was also, that hypothesis was probably true, in that they weren't, we weren't finding them coming from the other direction onto the runway. So mission accomplished there. We continued to run the traps not really knowing, the pond still had water in it, and that was really what we were monitoring to make sure that we could pull the traps. And so on the 20th of July, after a few days of only finding 1 salamander in a trap, we finally pulled all of the fencing in the traps. Well, we did have some mortality associated with this, not with the trapping. The trapping, we had no mortality, but the actual, the reason that we got involved was to try to save the salamanders from being run over or being desiccated. We did relocate 154 salamanders in total off of the runway and over to safe burrow sites, but 54 of these salamanders died, most of them from desiccation, so they would just get stuck outside when the sun came up, and I was really surprised at how many of them were wandering around still when conditions were really not favorable. 27 of them were found on pavement, which is primarily where we were looking for them, but we also found some incidentally in grasslands. There were a few that were run over by aircraft and vehicles that we found, and then one died of predation. So why did this happen this year? This had never happened before. We hadn't seen salamanders around this time of year. Well, of course, a big reason is because we had record rainfall. And so I took some Google Earth snapshots to show you sort of what this pond looked like in various years. And you can see that, and then there's rainfall. The chart is rainfall along the bottom there for Travis Air Force Base. You can see in years with lots of rainfall, like 2006 and then, of course, 2017, this pond actually enlarges. It's very large and remains wet late into the year. But in drier years like 2007 and 2009, there's only a tiny little bit of, it's actually an area that had been enlarged or had been deepened for cattle watering throughout the summer that remains with enough water for larvae to metamorphose. And so in most years, this pond isn't producing a lot of CTS juvenile or juvenile CTS, but in these large rainfall years, that's when this pond really produces a lot, and the habitat comes right up to the edge of the military's land. But the other key here is management, and so this is management of the land that surrounds that pond, so the private land, which is owned by the city of Fairfield and Solano County, and also management on the military base. So the salamander has a difficult time navigating these grasslands when they're very thatchy or when there's a high cover of these dead annual grasses, and that's certainly the case around the breeding pond. At some point in the past, grazing had been a little bit too heavy, and so they asked the lessee to back off the cattle grazing somewhat, and then in a year like this last year, when you have a lot of production of annual grasses, that combination means a lot of resistance for salamanders trying to leave the pond. The other part of that is the military likes to manage their lands to reduce the threat of bird strikes, and so they tend to mow or crop very short the grassland on around the airfield where this site is, and so it's perfect for salamanders wandering around. And the other thing that I remembered was that in the wintertime they had gone through and sprayed, the military had gone through and sprayed the fence line, and this is for security reasons. They want to make sure people and animals aren't getting underneath the fence like the hole there indicates, but it also made a great corridor for salamanders to just scoot right underneath the fence and onto the military lands. So the combination of those two management issues led to the salamanders preferentially choosing the runway as their habitat. So what happens in the future? This is just the beginning of the story, of course, but of course management recommendations are in order. We can't do anything about the weather except know that in high rainfall years we're probably going to see this phenomenon, but certainly grazing that pond, grazing that entire conservation area a little bit more heavily will hopefully draw the salamanders to the grasslands on the conservation land rather than on the military base, but also leaving that vegetation along the fence line will help to deter the salamanders from preferentially moving onto Travis Air Force Base. And of course, continuing to monitor the population, especially as management manipulations are made to see whether or not they're working and to see how the CTS are responding. And finally, I think we now know that this is happening, and so making sure that we're doing the annual monitoring of the roads and the runways to make sure that salamanders aren't getting desiccated or getting run over on those surfaces. That's it.
Any questions? One question for Jaymee?
Yes, sir.
migration back of the adults, the migration back from with the adults that have crossed the airfield.
Right.
Since now you have a known population, and you're going to have smaller numbers coming back of larger animals, which are, the reproducing valuable individuals that need to be protected more protected.
Absolutely. So that is certainly, there were a lot of proposals thrown out about putting, permanent fencing up, and that was one of the things I mentioned was that, then you have the adults not being able to get back to the breeding pond, which you don't want to keep that from happening. So definitely, the thing about the adults is that they're actually traveling on rainy nights in the dark. They're much more predictable, their movement patterns are, so it's easier to close down the roadways or to anticipate when they might be moving. And we're definitely going to do some monitoring this winter to determine sort of what that looks like, what their movement patterns are. And that's something we're still trying to figure out, how to protect those adults, as you said, that's super important for this population. But yeah, that's definitely going to be one of our big questions is how to make sure that they're protected and to better understand their movement patterns and exactly where they're coming from. So thanks for that question.
Thanks, Jaymee.